Do you think fear alone can kill a person? Share your thoughts in the comments. Why am I asking? Because this story takes us into the mind of an elderly woman, where whispers through a wireless spark tragedy. Subscribe now for more mysteries revealed every week, and watch closely till the end. The truth hides in the last detail. Let's start the story now. Chapter 1. A Doctor's Caution. Dr. Graham spoke with deliberate care as he addressed Charles Ridgway, the nephew of the frail old lady whose health was hanging by a thread. His words carried both reassurance and warning. "Now, please don't take this the wrong way," he began, his voice calm yet edged with seriousness. "Your aunt may live for many more years, and in all likelihood she will. But—" He hesitated for a moment, then suddenly snapped his fingers, the sharp sound cutting through the silence. "A sudden shock, or too much strain on her body, and it could all be over in an instant." Charles leaned forward, his expression tightening as he absorbed the gravity of the doctor's advice. Dr. Graham continued, his tone shifting to a more instructive note. "She must not overexert herself, nor dwell endlessly on her worries. But at the same time, she cannot simply sit and brood. Her mind must remain engaged, occupied with things that bring her a sense of ease and contentment." The young man gave a slow nod, his forehead creasing into thought. "Kept distracted," Charles repeated under his breath, almost as if testing how the phrase felt on his tongue. He was not a man who rushed into decisions. Rather, he preferred to let ideas take root, turning them over until they revealed their usefulness. Yet beneath his quiet manner lay a sharper truth. Charles Ridgway was a man who saw opportunity in circumstance. Whenever fate placed a situation in his path, he was quick to consider how it might be shaped or twisted toward his own advantage. What began as a doctor's gentle warning now lingered in Charles's mind as something far more intriguing, the words "kept distracted," taking on a weight the physician might never have intended. Trivia question. If you were in Charles Ridgway's position, would you follow the doctor's instructions faithfully, yes or no? Chapter 2. The wireless set and Charles's persuasion. That same evening, Charles Ridgway introduced an idea he was certain would improve his aunt's spirits: a wireless set. To him, it was not only a source of entertainment, but also the perfect solution to the doctor's warning that her mind must remain active. Mrs. Mary Harter, however, greeted the suggestion with clear unease. She had barely recovered from the disruption of having a lift installed in her home, and now her nephew was proposing another modern intrusion. "I'm not sure I care for all these contraptions," she murmured, her voice heavy with reluctance. "These waves, these electric waves, you never know what harm they may do." Her words carried the anxiety of someone who had never trusted new technology. Charles, patient but slightly patronizing, reassured her with practiced ease. "Aunt Mary, those fears are quite unfounded," he said smoothly, the corners of his lips hinting at a smile. Yet Mrs. Harter was not easily persuaded. "All that electricity," she protested, shuddering. "You may laugh, Charles, but I always feel dreadful before a thunderstorm. Surely that proves electricity can affect one's health." She gave a small, triumphant nod, convinced that her point was sound. Unwilling to admit defeat, Charles shifted tactics. With a polished confidence, he launched into a lengthy explanation about amplifiers, frequency adjustments, condenser units, and valves. The technical barrage was overwhelming to his elderly aunt, who soon felt lost in the maze of his jargon. Unable to follow his words, she finally relented with a hesitant sigh. "Well, Charles, if you truly believe it will help, that's the spirit, Aunt Mary," he replied warmly. "It will keep your thoughts lively, just what you need." His persistence had once again prevailed. Not long afterward, the lift was completed, an addition ordered by the doctor that nearly gave Mrs. Harter a turn, not from its function, but from the strangers who worked on it. Like many older women of her generation, she regarded unknown workmen with suspicion, convinced they might have designs on her silver. And then came the wireless. When the bulky set was finally placed in her sitting room, Mrs. Harter eyed it with deep mistrust. Its knobs, dials, and switches seemed to her less like instruments of progress and more like sinister devices. Charles, however, brimmed with enthusiasm as he demonstrated its wonders. "Listen, Aunt Mary, we're receiving Berlin. Isn't that marvelous?" "All I hear is dreadful buzzing and clicking," she answered flatly, unimpressed. Charles pressed on, fine-tuning with steady determination. "There, Brussels, clear as day." "Is it really?" she asked with the faintest flicker of interest. Before she could say more, a piercing screech filled the room. Mrs. Harter winced, then, with dry wit, remarked, "Well, it sounds more like the dog's home to me." For the first time, Charles laughed heartily, genuinely delighted. "You do have a gift for humor, Aunt Mary," he said with affection. Despite her distrust of the machine, even she could not resist a small smile. Her fondness for Charles ran deep. Once, she had intended to leave her estate to her niece, Miriam. But Miriam had proved an ungrateful and flighty disappointment, always restless, dismissive of her aunt's company, and eventually entangled with a young man whom Mrs. Harter could never approve of. The matter had ended in a final break, with Miriam sent back to her mother like a rejected purchase. Though Miriam later married, her aunt's only acknowledgement of her existence came in the form of uninspired Christmas gifts such as handkerchief cases. Charles, by contrast, had proven himself the model nephew. Attentive, thoughtful, and endlessly patient, he listened with apparent delight to every one of his aunt's rambling stories. Even when amusement flickered in his eyes, he never let it turn into boredom. He praised her, flattered her, and filled her days with attention. Thoroughly satisfied with her choice, Mrs. Harter had already summoned her solicitor, redrawn her will, and signed her name to the papers. Charles now stood as her heir. And now, in the matter of the wireless set, despite her initial resistance, he had prevailed once more. Trivia question. When Mrs. Harter first listened to the wireless, what did she humorously compare the screeching noise to? Chapter 3. The Voice Beyond the Static. At first, Mrs. Harter treated the wireless with suspicion, as though the strange device was an intruder in her quiet household. She had always preferred her books, her letters, or even the silent company of her own thoughts. Yet little by little, her resistance waned. Within weeks, she was not merely tolerating the wireless, she found herself looking forward to it, almost relishing the company it brought. Still, she much preferred her time with it when Charles was not hovering about. The problem with Charles Ridgway was his incessant interference. Whenever Mrs. Harter settled into her armchair, listening peacefully to a symphony or a historical lecture about figures such as the notorious Lucrezia Borgia, Charles would inevitably wander in. He could not resist fiddling with the dials, his restless fingers twisting knobs until the room was filled with a storm of crackles, bursts of foreign tongues, and chaotic static. What she sought as calm diversion, he turned into disorder. But when he was out for the evening, dining with friends, perhaps playing cards, she would claim the wireless as her own. 2 switches pressed, a steady hum, and she was transported to another world in serene solitude. Roughly 3 months after its installation, something happened that shifted her view from pleasure to dread. That particular evening, Charles was at a bridge party, leaving her entirely alone with the machine. The program was a ballad concert, and she was deeply moved by a soprano's heartfelt rendition of Annie Laurie. The voice filled the room with warmth, until, without warning, the melody broke off. A strange whirring, followed by clicks and a low buzzing, replaced the music. For a few seconds, only this odd mechanical sound lingered. Then came silence, so deep it pressed against her nerves. Out of that stillness, she heard it, a faint humming, distant and uncanny, as though the signal had stretched beyond the known world. And then, a voice, a man's voice. "Mary, can you hear me? It's Patrick speaking. I'm coming for you. Soon you'll be ready, won't you?" Mrs. Harter's breath caught. It was her husband's voice. Patrick. Dead for years, and yet unmistakably him, as if he were whispering from just over her shoulder. Before she could gather her wits, the song resumed seamlessly, the soprano's ballad flowing on as though nothing had happened. She sat rigid in her chair, gripping the arms so tightly her knuckles whitened. Was it imagination? A trick of fatigue? Why would she suddenly dream of Patrick now, after so long? The doctor's warning about her weak heart echoed in her mind. Perhaps this was not madness, but a warning from beyond, a reminder that her days were numbered, that her late husband was waiting to receive her. She rose unsteadily, muttering to herself, half bitter, "All that money wasted on a lift." A shake of the head, and she dismissed it outwardly, but the chill of that voice clung to her. She told no one, yet only a few days later, it returned. Again, she was alone in the drawing room, the wireless playing an unremarkable orchestral piece. Once more, the music faltered, then stopped entirely. Silence. That same eerie sensation of distance filled her, as though the signal had traveled farther than time itself. And then it came, the voice. "Mary, I am speaking to you. I will come for you very soon." It was Patrick again, but altered. The tone was thinner, more spectral, carrying a strange echo, like words carried on the wind from another realm. And then, just as suddenly, the cheerful orchestra resumed, perfectly normal, perfectly earthly. This time, Mrs. Harter did not doubt her senses. She had been wide awake. It was no dream, no fancy. She had heard him, her dead husband, calling her by name through the airwaves. Trivia. Question. Early wireless sets were notorious for picking up strange signals from unexpected sources. Do you think Mrs. Harter truly heard her late husband's voice, or was it simply interference from another broadcast? Answer in one word: paranormal or interference. Chapter 4. The Second Message and the Shadows of Doubt. Mrs. Harter's mind was still unsteady after the strange experience, and she found herself circling back to Charles's earlier explanation about ether waves and the invisible mysteries of sound. Could it truly be possible that Patrick's voice had reached her across some hidden gap in the scale of frequencies, slipping between those missing wavelengths Charles had mentioned? Perhaps, she thought, what people so often dismissed as the supernatural was simply science that had yet to be explained. It was not entirely unreasonable. After all, modern discoveries had revealed powers once thought impossible. Maybe Patrick had found a way to use such forces to warn her of what was coming. Her resolve sharpened. She tugged the bell cord, summoning her long-serving maid. Elizabeth entered quickly, her tall, angular figure as rigid as ever, though her eyes betrayed worry. Mrs. Harter fixed her with a steady look. "Elizabeth, do you remember what I told you? The top left-hand drawer of my bureau, locked, the long key with the white label. Everything is prepared." The maid's expression tightened, and her voice faltered. "Ready, Mum? For your burial?" Yes, of course, Mrs. Harter replied briskly, her tone almost impatient. You know perfectly well what I mean. You helped me set it all in order yourself. Elizabeth's stern mask crumbled, her face softening with grief. Oh, ma'am, please don't speak like that. You've been improving, stronger every day. Mrs. Harter smiled faintly, though her eyes were sharp. Nonsense, my dear. We all must go sometime. I've already outlived the allotted 70 years. That is nothing to cry over. With a dismissive wave, she added, Now don't go snivelling here. If you must weep, at least have the sense to do it elsewhere. The maid, her lips trembling, retreated quickly, muffling her sobs with her apron. Watching her go, Mrs. Harter shook her head, half amused, half touched. Silly old creature, but loyal. Very loyal. Her expression darkened with a practical thought. Now, was it £1 or only 50 I left her? It really should be 100. She's been with me longer than most. Chapter 5. Shadows at the window. The unease that had begun with the doctor's warning would not leave Mrs. Harter's mind. Sleep gave her no comfort, for even in her dreams an invisible weight pressed upon her. By morning, her resolve had sharpened into action. Sitting upright at her writing desk, she composed a careful letter to her solicitor, requesting a copy of her will. The steady scratch of the pen brought her a fleeting sense of order, as though putting her affairs in black and white could ward off the growing shadows around her. Yet the relief was fragile, lasting no longer than the ink's drying. Later that day at luncheon, an offhand remark from her nephew unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Charles, speaking between casual bites, leaned back and asked with apparent innocence, Aunt Mary, who is that peculiar fellow in the spare room? You know, the portrait above the mantel, the man with the wide-brimmed beaver hat and those extraordinary whiskers. The question made her stiffen, her voice firm as she replied, That, Charles, is your late Uncle Patrick, in his younger years. A quick flush of embarrassment colored his face. Oh, I say, Aunt Mary, forgive me. I didn't mean to sound disrespectful. She inclined her head, accepting his apology with composed dignity. But her sharp gaze did not leave him. Something in his hesitation suggested more than idle curiosity. With quiet insistence, she pressed him to explain what had truly prompted his question. Charles fidgeted, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. At first, he brushed it aside, calling it a silly thought. But under her steady scrutiny, his defenses crumbled. He leaned forward and confessed in a low voice, Well, it was really just a queer notion, nothing serious. Last night, as I came up the drive, I had the strangest impression. Someone was watching me from the window at the far end of the house. The face struck me as oddly familiar, almost old-fashioned, rather Victorian, if you will. When I later asked Elizabeth whether there were guests staying, she insisted we were alone. But then, when I entered the spare room, I saw the very same face staring at me from that portrait. Uncle Patrick, clear as daylight. He gave a short, uneasy laugh, as though determined to dismiss his own words. No doubt it was a trick of the shadows, or simply my imagination playing me false. Nothing worth troubling about. But Mrs. Harter did not join in his forced laughter. Her lips tightened, her eyes narrowing slightly as a chill seemed to drift through the room. What Charles regarded as harmless fancy struck her as something far more troubling. A sense of something uncanny was gathering around them, something that could no longer be dismissed with a shrug or a smile. Trivia question for viewers. Do you believe Charles truly glimpsed someone in the window that night, or was it merely his imagination? Yes or no? Chapter 6. The Final Message. Charles tried to brush the unsettling incident aside with forced logic. "I must have noticed that portrait at some earlier time without realizing it," he muttered to himself. Later, with even less conviction, he added, "Perhaps I only imagined the face at the window." Mrs. Harter, who had been listening with rapt attention, stiffened. Her voice, sharper than usual, broke through his words. "The end window, you said?" "Yes," Charles replied, surprised. "Why?" "Nothing," she answered quickly, though her tone betrayed unease. A shiver coursed through her. That window, she knew all too well, had once belonged to Patrick's dressing room. That evening, while Charles was away again, Mrs. Harter sat alone in her chair by the wireless. Her hands gripped the wooden arms tightly as she listened with almost painful anticipation. If the voice came again, there would be no more doubting. She would have proof that her late husband was indeed reaching across the grave. At first, the program played normally. Then, just as before, the cheerful music faltered, cut away into a heavy, breathless silence. Her chest tightened. And then it came, the same faint Irish lilt, charged with something unearthly. "Mary, you are prepared now. On Friday, I shall come for you. At 9:30. Do not be afraid. There will be no pain. Be ready." The final syllable was swallowed abruptly as the orchestra crashed back to life, blaring into the quiet room with jarring force. For several long moments, Mrs. Harter did not stir. Her face was ashen, her lips pressed into a pale, thin line. Finally, she rose, walked to her writing desk, and with a trembling hand, penned a note. "Tonight at 9:15, I distinctly heard the voice of my late husband. He told me he would come for me on Friday at 9:30. Should I die at that exact hour, this letter will serve as evidence of genuine communication from the spirit world." She signed it carefully. Mary Harter. Reading the words back, she gave a grim nod, sealed the note in an envelope, and rang the bell. Elizabeth, her maid, appeared almost at once, her face etched with concern. "Elizabeth," Mrs. Harter said steadily, handing her the envelope, "if I die on Friday night, this must be delivered to Dr. Manel." Elizabeth's hands shook as she took the note. "Oh, madam, please don't speak like that," she whispered, close to tears. But Mrs. Harter raised her chin firmly. "No arguments. You have often told me you trust your intuitions. Well, I have one now. And one more thing. I have left you £50 in my will, but if I cannot reach the bank myself, I want it doubled. Charles will see to it." At that, Elizabeth broke into sobs, but Mrs. Harter silenced her with a commanding gesture, dismissing the maid with quiet finality. The next morning, her resolve remained unshaken. She spoke to Charles directly. "Remember, if anything happens to me, Elizabeth must receive an additional 50. Charles laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "My dear Aunt Mary, you've been far too gloomy lately. Dr. Manel insists you'll still be here to celebrate your 100th birthday. 20 years from now, we'll all be raising a toast to you." She smiled at him fondly, but her reply was measured. "And what are your plans for Friday evening, Charles?" He hesitated. "The Wings have invited me to play bridge, unless you'd prefer me to stay." "No," she interrupted quickly, almost urgently. "Quite the opposite. That night of all nights, I would rather be alone." Charles gave her a puzzled glance but didn't press further. Whatever weighed on her mind was not something she was willing to share. Friday arrived with unnatural stillness. Mrs. Harter spent the day in preparation. She withdrew £50 in crisp banknotes and handed them to Elizabeth, ignoring the maid's tearful refusal. She carefully sorted through her possessions, labeling jewelry for friends and family. Cousin Emma was to receive the Worcester tea service. Young William, the delicate Sèvres jars. Nothing was left undone. From her desk she unfolded her will, recently sent over by Mr. Hopkinson. The instructions were simple. Elizabeth to receive £50 in gratitude, 2 larger legacies of £500 each to her sister and cousin, and the remainder of her estate to Charles. He would inherit a considerable fortune, and he deserved it, she told herself. He had been kind, attentive, and brought laughter to her life. But now, with the clock ticking ever closer to the fated moment, her composure began to fray. She repeated to herself that she was calm and unafraid, yet her heart hammered wildly beneath her ribs. At precisely 9:30, she turned on the wireless. She braced herself. Would she hear the forecast, or the dreaded, unmistakable tones of the dead? But what came was neither. A faint, fumbling noise rattled at the door. Her body stiffened. The sound came again, followed by a sudden icy draft that swept into the room. Her breath caught. For the first time she felt terror, pure, unyielding terror. A dreadful thought struck her. Patrick has been gone 25 years. He is a stranger to me now. Then it came. A dragging footstep outside. The door creaked, not on its hinges, but as though unseen hands moved it without resistance. Slowly, silently, it opened. Mrs. Harter lurched to her feet, her body swaying. Something slipped from her grasp, falling into the fire. Her eyes locked on the black doorway, wide with horror. A strangled cry rose in her throat, but before the sound escaped, the darkness engulfed her completely. Trivia. Question for viewers. If you heard a voice claiming to be from a loved one who had passed away, warning you of your own death, would you believe it was truly them, or dismiss it as imagination? Chapter 7. The Perfect Crime and the Truth Behind the Haunting. The doorway glowed faintly in the shadows, and from its depths emerged a figure that made Mrs. Harter's blood run cold. It was unmistakable. A man with a chestnut-brown beard, thick whiskers, and a long, old-fashioned coat that seemed borrowed from another century. Her heart gave a violent leap, seized in terror, and then faltered. For a moment it thudded once more, as though gripped by unseen fingers, before stopping altogether. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. Her frail body crumpled, collapsing into a motionless heap upon the rug. It was Elizabeth, faithful as ever, who discovered her mistress an hour later. She froze, horrified by the sight, then scrambled to summon Dr. Manel. A frantic note was dispatched to Charles Ridgway, pulling him away from his bridge party in town. Yet when the doctor arrived, there was no hope to be offered. Mrs. Harter had already slipped from the world of the living. 2 solemn days passed before Elizabeth remembered a folded paper her mistress had once entrusted to her. She handed it over to Dr. Manel, who read it with furrowed brows. His face reflected curiosity more than shock. "Remarkable," he murmured at last. "Your aunt seems to have suffered vivid hallucinations, convinced she heard her late husband's voice through the wireless. She must have been in such a heightened state of nervous agitation that, when the final moment came, the shock alone was enough to stop her heart." "Autosuggestion?" Charles asked in a low, carefully measured tone. "Something along those lines," the doctor replied. "We'll perform a post-mortem examination, though I doubt the results will reveal anything beyond natural causes." Charles inclined his head gravely, concealing the flicker of satisfaction behind his eyes. He already knew the investigation would uncover nothing suspicious. The night before, after the rest of the household had gone to bed, he had quietly removed a length of wire that connected the wireless cabinet in the drawing room to his own chamber above. Earlier that same evening, under the innocent pretext of the chill weather, he had asked Elizabeth to light a fire in his grate. Into those flames he had tossed a false beard of chestnut hair and a set of whiskers. They had burned quickly to ash. The Victorian-style coat and other items, borrowed from a trunk of his late uncle's relics, had been carefully returned to their chest in the attic. By morning, no trace of the masquerade remained. The idea had not been born overnight. It had first taken root when Dr. Manel had casually remarked that, with care and moderation, Aunt Mary might yet live many more years. Charles had smiled then, the image of a dutiful, loving nephew. But behind that mask lay desperation. His financial entanglements had grown perilous, his debts mounting to the point where prison threatened. To him, Aunt Mary's fortune was not an inheritance to be patiently awaited. It was the only lifeline that could rescue him from ruin. Now, as he moved efficiently through funeral arrangements, telegraphing distant relatives, securing lodging for guests, arranging the ceremony with the solemn diligence of a devoted nephew, his mind carried a quiet refrain. A masterstroke of business, he told himself. In the eyes of the world, Charles Ridgway was the grieving young man who had lost his beloved aunt. But beneath that carefully worn mask, he was far more than that. He was free, he was secure, and he was wealthy. And all of it, thanks to a crime so perfectly orchestrated that no one would ever suspect. Trivia question. In many classic mysteries, voices from beyond have been used as tools of deception. Can you think of another famous detective story outside of this one where supernatural elements are revealed to be nothing more than clever trickery? Chapter 8. The Sudden Unraveling. Charles had been staring ruin in the face not long ago. His finances dangled on the edge of disaster, the kind of abyss from which few men return. Yet here he was now, a man transformed. His clever little scheme, no crime, merely a harmless bit of manipulation, he told himself, had worked perfectly. The crushing weight of debt no longer pressed on his shoulders. He allowed himself a small, smug smile. Wealth was now his, and the future once again looked bright. But even victory has its shadows. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, her face as stern and unreadable as always. "Mr. Hopkinson has arrived, sir," she announced. Charles's pulse gave a small jump. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He quickly smoothed away his satisfaction, arranging his features into solemn dignity. With measured steps, he entered the library. Inside, seated with military precision at the desk, was Mr. Hopkinson, the elderly solicitor who had overseen Mrs. Harter's affairs for more than 2 decades. The man's posture was exact, his manner restrained, as though each word would be carefully weighed before being spoken. Charles extended the usual courtesies, but Hopkinson wasted no time on pleasantries. "I must admit, Mr. Ridgway," the lawyer said with a dry cough, "your letter left me puzzled. You appear to be under the impression that your late aunt's will is in our keeping." Charles blinked, confusion tightening his chest. "Well, of course it is," he said. "My aunt told me so herself." Hopkinson inclined his head slightly. "Indeed, it was in our possession. However, last Tuesday she wrote to us directly, requesting that her will be sent to her." The words sank into Charles like cold water. He tried to mask his reaction, but unease crept in. "Surely it will be among her effects, then," Hopkinson suggested. Charles swallowed hard. "I've already searched everything, every paper, every drawer. There was nothing." His voice sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "Was anyone else allowed to examine her belongings?" the lawyer asked evenly. "Only Elizabeth, her maid," Charles admitted reluctantly. Elizabeth was summoned. She entered with the same rigid poise she always carried. When questioned, she answered without hesitation. She had personally sorted through her mistress's clothes and papers. She knew the will well. had even seen it the very morning of Mrs. Harter's death, tucked inside a long blue envelope. She recalled her mistress handing her £50 in cash from that very envelope. "You are certain of this?" Hopkinson pressed. "Yes, sir. Later I even placed the empty blue envelope on this very table. I remember it clearly." Charles forced a casual tone, though his insides churned. "Yes, I remember seeing it as well." He retrieved the envelope and handed it over. Hopkinson examined it with sharp eyes and gave a small nod. "This is indeed the one." A heavy silence filled the room. Before Elizabeth left, the solicitor asked quietly, "There was a fire in the grate that evening, was there not?" "There always was, sir," she answered, then departed. Charles realized with a shock that his hand was trembling where it rested against the desk. He clenched it into a fist. "What are you suggesting?" he demanded. Hopkinson's reply was measured. "We must hope the will resurfaces. If it does not, then I must conclude that Mrs. Harter destroyed it herself. She requested it after all, and she did ensure Elizabeth received her legacy in cash. Perhaps she wished to simplify matters." Panic twisted inside Charles. "But why would she do such a thing?" he burst out. The lawyer's gaze was cool. "You had no disagreements with your aunt, did you?" Charles flinched, feigning outrage. "Certainly not. We were always close, right up to the very end." Hopkinson's neutral "ah" carried more doubt than belief. Charles suddenly knew the lawyer didn't trust him. Perhaps he had heard whispers of Charles's mounting debts, his reckless ventures. Could Mrs. Harter have heard as well? Had she suspected? Had she, in those final hours, struck his name from her intentions? The thought clawed at him. A dreadful image rose unbidden. His aunt collapsing in her chair, her fingers slackening, the blue envelope slipping into the fire, flames curling around her last testament. His breath caught. His skin turned icy. "If the will is never found," he whispered hoarsely. Hopkinson gave the fatal answer. "Then the previous will, dated September 1920, remains valid. Under that document, her estate passes in its entirety to her niece, Mrs. Miriam Robinson." The words struck him like a blow. Miriam, that dull, simpering woman with her joyless husband and her brood of noisy children. Everything he had worked for, every careful step of his plan, undone, and for them. The shrill ring of the telephone split the air. Mechanically, Charles answered. "Ridgway." The doctor's genial voice came down the line. "Just finished the autopsy. Cause of death exactly as expected. But here's something interesting. Her heart condition was worse than I thought. 2 months at best, even with the finest care." Charles froze. His knuckles whitened around the receiver. "Say that again," he croaked. 2 months, no more," the doctor repeated. "Figured that might comfort you." But Charles had already slammed the receiver down. Hopkinson was speaking, his voice distant and blurred. "Mr. Ridgway, are you unwell?" Charles's nails dug into the desk. Unwell. The word mocked him. No wealth, no future, nothing but ruin, and the creeping image of prison walls closing in. Somewhere, he thought bitterly, someone was laughing at him. Trivia. Question for viewers. If a person dies without a valid will, what is the legal term for how their estate is distributed, probate or intestacy? Chapter by chapter immersive analysis for you. Chapter 1. A doctor's caution. Dr. Graham carefully warns Charles Ridgway that his elderly aunt, Mary Harter, must be shielded from shocks and kept mentally active. Charles listens intently, but beneath his calm exterior, we sense a calculating man already considering how such advice might serve his interests. What began as a medical warning quietly plants the seed for Charles's later manipulations. Lesson: guidance meant for care can be twisted when placed in the wrong hands. Compassion and calculation walk a fine line. Viewer: question: if you were in Charles's place, would you have followed the doctor's advice honestly? Yes or no? Chapter 2: The Wireless Set and Persuasion. Charles persuades his reluctant aunt to accept a wireless set. Though she mistrusts modern gadgets, his persistence wears her down. Her fondness for Charles, already stronger than for her estranged niece Miriam, cements her decision to make him heir. Charles appears the devoted nephew, but his subtle flattery and persistence suggest deeper motives. Lesson: influence often comes not from force, but from persistence disguised as care. Viewer: question: when Mrs. Harter first listened to the wireless, what did she humorously compare the screeching noise to? Chapter 3: The Voice Beyond the Static. Alone with the wireless, Mrs. Harter hears what seems to be her dead husband's voice breaking through the static. At first, she doubts her senses, but when it happens again, her fear deepens. For her, the wireless shifts from novelty to haunted messenger. Lesson: loneliness and fear can make people vulnerable to illusions or to deliberate manipulation. Viewer question: do you think she truly heard her husband's voice, or was it just interference? Answer in one word: paranormal or interference. Chapter 4: The Second Message and Doubt. Mrs. Harter, unsettled, begins preparing her affairs. She ensures her will and instructions are ready, even confirming details with her maid Elizabeth. Charles, meanwhile, mentions seeing a figure resembling Uncle Patrick, deepening the sense of a haunting. To Aunt Mary, the messages feel less like coincidence and more like destiny approaching. Lesson: fear, once seeded, can shape choices as powerfully as fact. Viewer: question: do you think Charles truly saw someone at the window, or was it only his imagination? Yes or no? Chapter 5: Preparations for the End. Believing her time is near, Mrs. Harter writes to her solicitor, reviews her will, and sets aside money for Elizabeth. Though frightened, she acts with dignity, organizing her affairs as though preparing for a final journey. This practical resolve contrasts sharply with the eerie dread of the wireless. Lesson: facing mortality, some choose to prepare calmly rather than deny the inevitable. Viewer: question: would you make your own preparations if you believed a supernatural warning of death, or dismiss it as superstition? Chapter 6: The Final Message. The wireless delivers a chilling prophecy. Patrick's voice promises to come for her on Friday at 9:30. Mrs. Harter writes a letter testifying to her experience and entrusts it to Elizabeth. When Charles suggests staying with her that evening, she refuses. She wants to face it alone. The clock ticks toward the promised hour. Lesson: fear of the unknown can feel stronger than faith in the living. Viewer: question: if a voice from beyond told you the exact day and hour of your death, would you believe it? Chapter 7: Friday Night and Terror. On the appointed evening, Mrs. Harter gives Elizabeth money, labels her belongings, and sits alone with the wireless. At 9:30, instead of music, she hears noises at the door and sees a ghostly figure resembling her late husband. Overcome by terror, her frail heart fails. She collapses, dead, seemingly claimed by the supernatural. Lesson: the greatest danger of fear is that it can kill long before reality does. Viewer: question: do you think she died from genuine supernatural forces, or from sheer fright manipulated by human hands? Chapter 8: The Perfect Crime Unveiled. After her death, Charles appears the grieving nephew, but the truth emerges in subtle hints. He used wires, disguises, and props to impersonate the ghostly voice and figure. His motive was financial survival. Yet when the solicitor arrives, Charles discovers his aunt had recalled her will before she died. Instead of inheriting, he is left ruined. In a cruel irony, his elaborate crime brings him nothing. Lesson: greed blinds men to irony. Plots spun too cleverly may trap the schemer himself. Viewer: question: do you think Charles deserved his downfall, or was it fate's cruelest joke? Chapter 9: The Twist of Justice. The solicitor arrives with final documents, and Charles, anticipating his inheritance, acts the part of the dutiful mourner. But his triumph collapses when he learns that Aunt Mary had revoked her will before her death. The fortune he schemed so hard to secure slips through his fingers. The story closes not with police intervention, but with poetic justice. Charles is left penniless, haunted not by ghosts, but by the consequences of his own greed. Lesson: sometimes justice arrives without courts or detectives, through irony and the turning of fate. Viewer: question: do you think poetic justice is more satisfying than legal punishment in a story like this? Let's discuss key characters. At the heart of the story is Mary Harter, the elderly woman whose fragile health and loneliness make her the perfect target for manipulation. Her belief in the supernatural warnings delivered through the wireless sets the entire tragedy in motion. Her nephew, Charles Ridgway, presents himself as the caring relative, but is in truth the calculating figure behind the scheme, exploiting her fears to secure her fortune. Dr. Graham plays a smaller but essential role, his advice about Mary's health serving as the foundation that Charles twists for his own purposes. The loyal maid, Elizabeth, provides a human counterpoint to the deception. She serves faithfully, receives Mary's final instructions, and becomes a silent witness to the unraveling events. In the background looms the spectral presence of Patrick Harter, Mary's late husband, whose supposed voice over the wireless is conjured up as part of the cruel hoax. Finally, the solicitor enters near the conclusion, not to solve the crime, but to deliver the ironic twist. Mary's fortune slips beyond Charles's reach, leaving his elaborate scheme worthless. Final thoughts. In the end, Wireless is not only a tale of deception, but also a study of how fear can be weaponized. Mary Harter's tragedy shows how loneliness and vulnerability make fertile ground for manipulation, while Charles's downfall reminds us that greed often destroys itself. Christie weaves a quiet irony into the conclusion. Justice comes not from police or courts, but from fate itself, leaving the schemer with nothing. The wireless, a symbol of progress, becomes an instrument of cruelty, warning us that every tool depends on the hands that use it. Thank you for staying with me through this mystery. Do you believe Charles's punishment was fair, or do you think he escaped too lightly? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy unraveling Christie's puzzles with me, don't forget to subscribe now, because each week we dive into another story where human nature hides its darkest secrets.